During the Peloponnesian War, there was a very effective Spartan commander by the name of Brasides. In fact, some historians suggest that he may have been one of the greatest officers in Spartan history. Plutarch tells us this little anecdote story of something he had said in response to something that had happened to him during the war. It says, quote, after a spear had penetrated through his shield in some battle and wounded him, he pulled it out with the very same weapon, killed his opponent. And when asked how he had been wounded, he said, quote, when my shield betrayed me. There are dozens upon dozens of these types of anecdotal stories. And what is supremely true, despite the pushback from revisionists, is that Sparta, without a doubt, was the most effective fighting force in ancient Greece. I hesitated there because I think there's actually a case to make that during the classical period, they were probably the most effective fighting force in all of the ancient world. Their capabilities weren't there, right? So they couldn't, for example, the Persian Empire could mobilize a vast army with massive logistical and supply lines. Sparta couldn't mobilize that type of force. However, pound for pound in the field, if you put a Spartan army up against the best from Persia or Athens or wherever, they were likely going to win. With that said, they weren't invincible. There's this bizarre case that revisionists make today that mainstream people, like in 2024, believe that the Spartans were superhuman. Like they were all fucking Captain America, which is dumb because no one actually thinks that. It's bewildering to me. They show the evidence that like they lost battles, which they did because they're humans. They weren't, they were imperfect. Anyways, in order to fully understand why they were so good in the war fighting capacity, we have to do a deep dive analysis of the Spartan education system, the Agoge. And yes, that is how you pronounce it. I am Zachary Masick. Welcome to the Dead Warrior Society podcast. There are a lot of components when it comes to building a professional army, regardless of the time period, right? Ancient or modern. These sort of the two pillars, though, that you have to have an effective professional army is routine exercise, athletic training. And that can come in a variety of forms, by the way, drilling, calisthenics, whatever. And the other is discipline. Without these two pillars, you will have an ineffective fighting force, or at least a force that is only capable of doing so much. The Spartan army had both these things, and they were very focused in on both of these sort of facets of their way of life and their military. Now, just a brief overview. I'm assuming most of you know what the Agoge is, but just to give you kind of a roundabout explanation, like 30,000 bird's eye view, if you will. It was the Spartan education system that was compulsory by the state, meaning if you were born from a Spartan man and a Spartan woman, you had to go through the Agoge. And it started at 7 years old and it went to approximately 20 years old. And in order to be a full citizen of Sparta, a male citizen, obviously, women weren't allowed to be citizens. You had to graduate. There were two sort of key features, requirements, if you will, to become a Spartan citizen. One of those was graduating from the Agoge. And yes, there were individuals who did not graduate and they were of lesser status within Sparta. Now, our sources about the Agoge specifically, we get like little hints and tidbits from a variety of our sources, but there are two in particular that go into pretty great detail about it. Plutarch is one of them in his Life of Lycurgus, who is the Spartan lawgiver, supposedly existed in the 7th century, which I'm not going to get into. Actually, was it 7th century? Might have been 8th century. And then we also have Xenophon, who we've previously talked about in our last episode. He was the Athenian general who was very, very, very closely tied into the Spartans. He fought with them and he was there. And he is a great source, despite what many say. And the reason I say that is because he was literally in Sparta at its height. I mean, like he fought with them in Asia, Agesilaus. He supposedly, according to some historians, sent two of his sons into the Agoge, which is actually like a super cool feature in Greece. Aristocrats, which outside of Sparta were the only ones who could afford an education for their kid. They would sometimes, if there was a great tutor or school or whatever in Corinth, but you're an Athenian, you could send your kid to Corinth. It wasn't unheard of. It was like boarding school. I'm going to touch on women's role within Spartan society very briefly. In fairness to the sort of women component within Sparta, they frankly deserve their own episode entirely. It's pretty fascinating. But the point I really want to make is the child rearing, preparing young boys to become Spartans was one of the most important things culturally within their society. I mean, it's everywhere. Like they're obsessed with it to the point they're trying to figure out how to have specific kinds of sexual intercourse in order to produce the most effective sons that would be, eventually turn into fighters, which really signals to this audience that their main focus was creating the most effective fighting force in ancient Sparta. But it started with the children. And that, as we know, babies come from women. I know that's controversial in 2024, but they understood this. And so they wanted to prepare the women for that, for being pregnant, for having children in the best way possible. Plutarch tells us this, quote, "First, he toughened the girls by physically making them run and wrestle and throw the discus and javelin. Thereby, their children in embryo would make a strong start in strong bodies and would develop better, while the women themselves would also bear their pregnancies with vigor and would meet the challenge of childbirth in a successful, relaxed way." So, according to Plutarch, even back then, they were aware that a healthy woman, a physically active woman, was better prepared for pregnancy just for all the health related reasons than a woman who was static or overweight, which is, super interesting. Now, like I had mentioned earlier, women, it's a fascinating topic. I'm not going to go dive too deeply into it, but I want to point out there's this sort of argumentation that a lot of sort of the mainstream narrative, high school, you may have heard that women in Sparta had more rights. The revisionists argue that wasn't the case, that women were treated horrifically. The truth is, quite frankly, they're both kind of true, right? Like women in the ancient world had it tough. Like, let's be honest. Women up until like 100 years ago or 50 years ago had a pretty hardened society. With that said, though, our idea of right, the one thing that I want to mention is we superimpose our understanding of the world and of how rights and government function based on our experiences today. To say that women had more rights in Sparta is a bit of a stretch. They technically had no governmental rights. With that said, they could certainly do things that other Greek women in other city-states could not do, up to and including owning land ownership, which actually, I believe Aristotle was very critical of the Spartans about this fact. Anyways, but the main point here is they wanted to take advantage of as much as they could to prepare the young boys in infancy and in childhood to become Spartiates, and they knew that started with the women. Another key feature about the Agoge, they made the boys suffer. It was brutal by all available accounts. And by brutal, they physically beat them if they misbehaved. This may be difficult for us to understand today, and obviously I'm not advocating for beating children. But with that said, if you want to discipline young people, particularly kids and or young adults, there has to be kind of a carrot and a stick. And this is particularly true when it comes to military training, as we'll find out. But in order to prepare them to go into battle and go on campaigns, you have to make them hard. You have to physically strengthen them. So they can handle any situation physically. They're not going to get so gassed when they're going on campaign and they can't walk anymore. But there's also, obviously, just as importantly, the mental component. When your body wants to quit, when you want to give up, you continue to move forward. You have to train that. That people aren't necessarily born with that feature. You have to train that. You have to instill that in them. That often comes from a brutal regime and being trained in a military atmosphere, as we often see in Hollywood when they're talking about training young Marine recruits, for example. Xenophon states, quote, "Rather than letting the boys' feet grow soft in shoes, he told them emphatically to make them strong by not wearing shoes, in the belief that this practice would enable them to walk uphill with greater ease and come down with greater safety, while the boy who is accustomed to having no shoes on his feet should jump and bound and run faster than the one with shoes, and instead of their clothes serving to make them delicate, he required them to become used to a single garment all year round. The idea being that thereby they would be better prepared for both cold and heat. I also want to make a note here as well. There's this misunderstanding that in ancient Greek warfare, really the ancient world generally, that most combat situations were pitched battles. It's kind of like in the movies. Two armies come up, they meet, they collide, everyone dies, and then there's clearly a victor. Most battles in the Greek world were actually not this. Most battles were a combination of raiding, ambushes, minor skirmishes. And the reason I wanted to bring it up is because by making the boys essentially survive in the wilderness very often during the Agoge, they would have to make these beds out of reed sticks from the Eurotas River, which cuts right through Sparta, and they're supposedly, I read somewhere that they're very uncomfortable, right? So what does all this do? By making these young kids suffer, it prepares them for being in very shitty situations. It turns out being in war kind of sucks. It's not very comfortable. All the amenities that we enjoy in our sort of everyday, ordinary, comfortable lives are gone. You're not sleeping. You're tired. You're hungry. You're exhausted because maybe you've been marching all day. Oh, you've been marching all day? Well, guess what? The enemy is right over there and they're coming towards us and we need to fight it. Like, there's so many things about being a soldier that it's very difficult. It is like completely anathema to what you want to do as a human being on a day-to-day basis. And so in order to prepare young men for those situations, you have to make them suffer. You have to make them suck. That's why when you go join the US Army today, it's not fun. Like if you hear my voice, I'm getting excited. I'm getting excited because I've heard historians criticize the Spartans. They were super duper meanie, boo boo bee boo 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 to the boys. Ooh, they were so hard. Yes, they were. Because when you make mistakes in combat, you fucking die. Like, or worse, which it is worse, your buddy dies. So they're trying to correct that before they go into combat. They create this entire culture around this idea that if you betray your allies, if you flee from battle, if you surrender, oh my God forbid, in Sparta, if you surrender, you're a social pariah. You're a fucking outcast, right? There's a reason for that, because they wanted to ensure when their guys went into combat, whatever the situation was, they weren't going to quit. We do that today, revisionist historians. We do that today in special operations. If you quit and you're in buds, or worse, if you get your trident and you get to your platoon, your SEAL platoon, and you quit on a deployment or in train or whatever, you're done. You're done. It's the exact same concept, and it's deeply embedded in Spartan culture. Okay, I apologize. I keep going on these rants. Another aspect of the Agoge, they would only feed the boys just enough to survive, so they were basically never satiated. And they were not only permitted, but encouraged to go out and steal food wherever they could. But if they were caught, they would get severely punished. Obviously, the case being that if this was the real world and you were getting caught, you're probably going to die. Moreover, when you were going out and stealing food, when you're out in the wilderness, when you're out surviving, Plutarch, I think it was Plutarch, he points out that this helped, or maybe it was Xenophon, I can't remember, but this would help the boys train them to lie in wait. What that is in reference to is that in order to, even in the ancient world, be an effective soldier, you had to be tactically sound. Now, obviously, that's different from today, right? They weren't wearing like camis out in the wilderness doing some kind of patrol or whatever through the jungle of Vietnam. But the point is you still, if you were laying an ambush in ancient Greece, you had to be tactically sound. If you weren't and you gave up your position, then the ambush would be ineffective. Another critical component, and this sort of ties into the discipline aspect of the Agoge, was the commitment to obeying the rule of law in Sparta. This is absolutely crucial. This is like a theme that they talk about over and over and over again. And it's why Leonidas didn't leave Thermopylae, because in accordance with their law, obedient they lie, or some version of that. He could not abandon his post because that would be going against Spartan law. And all of those ideas began to be ingrained in the boys very, very early on at a very early age. And this is, again, part of discipline. Here is the rule. You follow the rule. You do not break the rules. And if you do, we will make sure you never fucking forget that you broke the rules. This is true in the United States Army and the Marine Corps today. You take these raw recruits and you break them down and you instill discipline in them. And there are all these new rules that they have to follow within the ranks of being in the military that they never had to follow before. There's uniform codes. There are, if you're not at work on time, they'll smoke your balls off. Like there's so many aspects, there's so many new rules, so many things you don't have to deal with as a civilian that you have to deal with as a soldier. Conduct in warfare is a big one, which you could talk about for hours. I'm not going to get into that. Without discipline, no professional army could exist. As I said earlier in the beginning, athletics and discipline are the foundational basis of any professional army. And obedience to the law is part of that sort of discipline. I just want to give one quick example of how strict they were about following the rules in Spartan law. There was a king, there were many kings. There was one Spartan king named Demaratus, and a question came up about his bloodline. You had to have a pure royal bloodline to be king. And when it was discovered that he may not have that, he was kicked out of Sparta, ended up going and joining the Persians. And again, this is according to Plutarch. One of the things that Plutarch tells us that happened to him, supposedly something he had said, is this, quote, when someone asked why he, a king, was in exile from Sparta, he said, quote, because her laws are more powerful than I. And this, by the way, is a redundant, like this happens over and over again. Many kings, presumably because they're granted flexibility in leadership when they go on campaign, it became an issue where they would start to do things they were not supposed to do. And they adopted different ideas and different cultures when they were campaigning. And what happened as a result was they were breaking Spartan law, and they either killed them or exiled them. Leadership at all times in the Agoge, they had someone in charge. In other parts of Greece, for children that were going through some sort of educational system, this was not the case. They might have a slave that was a tutor, which is what Plutarch points out to us. But in Sparta, you always had someone in charge, whether it was some full-fledged Spartiate who was called the trainer-in-chief, or it was an older adolescent boy who was responsible for overseeing the younger kids and making sure they weren't doing anything they were supposed to be doing. Our sources tell us, quote, Lycurgus, in place of the private assignment of slave tutors to each boy, stipulated that a man from the group out of which the highest office holders are appointed should take charge of them. He is called the trainer-in-chief. Lycurgus gave this man authority both to assemble the boys and to punish them severely whenever any misbehaved while in his charge. He also gave him a squad of young adults equipped with whips to administer punishment when necessary. The result has been that respect and obedience in combination are found to be a high degree in Sparta. Okay, so the point being, again, you always had someone in charge of you, and as the boys got older, they would have more and more cadre overseeing what they were doing, and they actually kept them much busier than when they were younger. And there's a reason for that. But before we get to that, I just want to mention briefly, this is exactly how the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. military generally sets up training. When you go to basic training, you have 3 drill sergeants. On top of that, the drill sergeants assign the most squared away dudes within your platoon to be squad leaders, team leaders, and then some version of like a platoon sergeant. You are always being monitored, and it prevents you from doing stupid shit and breaking the rules, right? Someone who's always looking over your shoulder. There's always a chain of command. The other thing this does too is it teaches these individuals how to be leaders, how to be in charge of other guys. Because when you first join the military, oftentimes you've never been in charge of somebody else. If you're a 13-year-old kid in the Agoge, there's a chance that you've never had any leadership responsibility up until that point. And then all of a sudden, one of the Spartiates comes in and he's like, hey, fucking Demaratus, or I don't know any Spartan names off the top of my head. Hey, fuckface, you're in charge of the 8-year-old kids. And so now you've got to herd cats and make sure these kids are right. Because guess what? If those kids do something they're not supposed to be doing, guess who's getting in trouble? The 13-year-old kid, which I'm going to go into that a little bit later because we need to talk about that. But the point I want to make here is this is the exact same structure we have in the U.S. military. It's the exact same. Like, I'm reading the source material and I'm like, yo, this is what I went through in basic training. So as the boys got older into their teens, obviously they became more rambunctious. The Spartans certainly knew this. And Xenophon tells us this: because he appreciated at this age, youths became very self-willed and are particularly liable to cockiness, both of which produce very powerful cravings for pleasure. This was the age at which he loaded them with the greatest amount of work and contrived that they should be occupied for the maximum time. In fact, further prescription that anyone who avoided this work would gain no future honor prompted concern not just from public officials, but also from the family of each of the youths, who did not want shrinking on their part to result in the total loss of reputation in the community. So basically what happened was, much like today, parents want to ensure that their kids specifically boys between the ages of like 12 and 18, are so loaded with not only school, but extracurricular activities that it doesn't allow them any time to get into trouble, which, as we know, young men, I mean, God, if you're a guy, think back to when you were the shit you were getting up to when you were 13, 14, and 15. Now, it is this particular section of Xenophon's explanation of the Agoge in the Spartan constitution, at least that's what they call it, that historians suggest that this is the evidence where the boys really start to get into more militaristic training, more martial training from the ages of approximately 14 to 20. In the beginning, it's just teaching the young boys what it means to be a Spartiate, what it means to be in the Agoge, how to stand in formation, how to be obedient to the rules, et cetera, et cetera. It's much like the first 3 weeks of Army basic training. You're really not learning how to be a soldier in those weeks. You're standing in a lot of formations. You're getting yelled at. You're getting your ass smoked. You're getting in shape, doing a ton of PT. They're teaching you how to wear your uniform, how to stand at attention, so on and so forth. But those are the building blocks. You have to start there before you can get to the actual, the part where you actually learn how to do the soldiering. Another interesting feature, young would-be Spartiates were allowed to attend messes, the Spartiate messes, as guests. Presumably, that's kind of a motivating factor. I remember saying, like, special forces teams, even at a distance, wandering around Fort Bragg when I wanted to be one of them. And it was huge. I mean, just being in their presence was a huge motivating factor. So that's how I read this section, at least. All right, I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to do another video later because this is already super long. Tune in. Deuces. Okay, I realize I am not wearing the same t-shirt because I'm drinking and I want to finish this episode, and I have like 30 minutes. Stand by. Cheers. These episodes might be better when I'm drunk anyways. Yeah. One of the key features of the Agoge, and they talk about this repeatedly, both of our sources, is the use of competition between the Spartans, the Spartan children, that is, to better advance them and prepare them for warfare. And I know what you're thinking, like, what is competition? Like, what does competing have to do with warfare? But I mean, think about it for 2 seconds. Warfare is the ultimate competition. And moreover, which I say a lot in this podcast, there's something about there's this sort of natural human behavior that makes especially young men competitive with one another. We see something we want, or we want to be better than them. And if you read Homer, like if you read any ancient Greek stuff, the Greeks were so competitive. I mean, they used every excuse they could to compete with one another, typically in athletic games, but not always. They did like cultural festival competitions, and Paul Cartledge talks about it, which I'll mention in a minute here. But the point that I want to make is the Spartans were fully aware that young men were competitive just naturally. Instead of allowing that to fester and turn into something negative, they leveraged that to make them the best versions of themselves. Xenophon explains it this way. He says, quote, and this is a long quote, so just bear with me here. He says, quote, he, meaning Lycurgus, the Spartan lawgiver, he came to think that if he could also urge the young adults to compete in excellence, then they would attain the height of manly gallantry. Let me explain how he used, in fact, to urge them. From among them, the E4s, which was the highest ranking office within the Spartan government. The E4s selected 3 of those in their prime. These men are called the Hippogrietae. Each of these picks 100 men with a clear explanation of why he was approving some and rejecting others. As a result, those who do not achieve the honor are at war with both those who have dismissed them and those chosen instead of them. And the 2 groups are on the lookout for any neglecting act which may contravene accepted standards of honor. This is also the type of competition most highly favored by the gods and best suited to a citizen community, to which the conduct required of the brave man is spelled out in each of the 2 groups independently strives to ensure that it will always prove superior, while should any need arise, they would as one protect the city with all of their might. They must keep themselves physically fit too, since the rivalry actually makes them come to blows whenever they meet, end quote. So it's quite brilliant. So what they did was, when the boys were at a sort of like an older age, maybe like 15 or 16, I think, they would take the E4s, so like the EFRIT, like I mentioned before, it's complicated. We're going to get into the government and stuff later on, but just know that they were arguably the most powerful sort of branch. There were sort of three branches of this, there were three branches of the Spartan government. They were, technically speaking, one of the most powerful branch in that government, whatever, circle, if you will. Anyways, they would go into the Agoge. So you have this direct connection between the government and the training of these young would-be Spartiates. And they pick the three. They say, okay, you now are going, you're going to pick boys to join your little army, your little cohort. Like, by the way, if you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, like we did this on the playground when I was a kid, like this is dodgeball. You know, when I was in high school, like there would be captains of the team and we would pick. The difference though, is that the teams would endure and you would compete constantly with one another. And you were essentially, like when you chose somebody or you didn't choose somebody, the captains had to explain why they did or did not choose that individual. So you were calling them out socially. The Spartans were constantly putting on public displays of approval or disapproval. And part of that was sort of the social engineering so that they could force people to be the best versions of themselves, because nobody wants to be an outcast in society, particularly like a martial militaristic society. And so they would do this. And then imagine your dodgeball team now, you get chosen. And like when the teachers aren't looking, you just beat the shit out of each other. Or when one team does something dishonorable, you rat on them, apparently, which ratting on people doesn't really seem like a thing. But that's what Xenophon says happened. So anyways, they would use these competitions. They would do these mini battles in these mini wars. And by the way, all of this conflict, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And what I mean is when you take a group of young men that share a culture and you put them at odds with one another and they go toe to toe with one another and they beat the shit out of each other, what comes out of that, bizarrely, and I won't pretend to understand this because it's some social science thing, is they actually become closer. Like I remember when I was in the military and I was on my ODA, made it through, I was in special forces now. And there was these two guys, the team was kind of split into the older guys and the younger guys. And the older guys just ragged on the younger dudes constantly. And there was one individual it's a long story. Anyways, he was in conflict with one of the older guys that had been on the team for quite some time. What's fascinating is they finally came to blows and they like literally beat the shit out of each other in the team room. And then the strangest thing ever was after that, I wouldn't say they were like best friends, but it was fine. Like it was super kosher between them. Like they got along great. And in fact, the one guy, the older guy who was really ragging on the younger dude, it's like this weight was lifted off his shoulders just by, grappling or beating the shit out of each other. Anyways, it's fascinating. The Spartans clearly knew that it existed and they leveraged that to make them the best versions of themselves as soldiers. Just to reiterate some of my own experience in the military and regarding the competitions in the military for me started effectively from day one. It was like we had our one-on-one competitions between guys in the platoons. Like I remember we did this huge wrestling day where there were, I think, how many guys were there? I think it was like 130 guys in the company, give or take. And we did Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which the Army refers to as combatives. And they did like a bracket and we all wrestled each other and beat the shit out of each other. So that was one form of competition. And we would all watch, like you'd all stand around the mats and watch each dude go and fight one another. And they would, each platoon, you would be representing your platoon. Sometimes you were fighting guys from other platoons and you would cheer each other on. And all of this created camaraderie. And then we would do exercises where we'd have competitions between the different platoons. And so one, for example, we were in full kit, all, plate carrier, rifle, helmet, all that shit. And we had the litter out. It was a down man exercise. And so what we do is the guy would be like dead and we'd have to run 2 miles around this track. And it was, 4 teams, 1 for each platoon. That was another competition we did. But that followed us, that those types of instances, those types of examples, those competitions, we did that when I was in special forces. Like I remember the ODAs in my company competing. We did multiple events. There was a swim in the ocean, a run along the beach. Hold on, let me get some gin. And then there was some sort of like pull up, push up thing. But the point being is just to be redundant here. But the US military is without a doubt the most effective fighting force the world has ever seen. And that's without question. Obviously, I'm biased, but like, come on, they are. Jesus Christ. And there is a direct correlation with the Spartan army and what they were doing explicitly in the Agoge. I get fired up about this stuff because there are some revisionist historians that just say asinine shit, and it drives me up a fucking wall. And it's so obvious that the Spartans knew exactly what they were doing, and it was in an effort to better prepare their young men for warfare. Now, the other major component of the Agoge was the dedication to athleticism. Both Aristotle and Plato actually concluded that, or they criticized the Spartans. They said, you take way too much time focusing on athletic training, military training, and you don't do enough lessons or education on virtue, wisdom, knowledge, so on and so forth. And so they did. They spent a lot. Even the revisionists will admit like that, yeah, the Spartans spent a ton of their time in the gymnasia training physically. They would do things, you know, kind of the stereotypical ancient Greek exercises: javelin, discus, grappling or wrestling, running, boxing. What kills me is that the revisionists will suggest that none of this had anything to do with warfare or combat. You got a PhD from some school and you think athleticism and training in various sports has nothing to do with warfare. I mean, has to be just the dumbest conclusion you can come up with. I mean, my God, my entire military career, I was in the Army for give or take 10 to 12 years. A lot of that was active duty. Part of that was in the National Guard. And then I went and did some other things for the federal government. Anyways, it's safe to say I spent a lot of my time preparing and going to war in various capacities. The one thing we did on a daily basis was some form of exercise. And it could be anything. It could be, a lot of times it was running and weightlifting and ruck marching, right? Like kind of typical. But combat, guys who were in combat roles in the military, we were obsessed with athletics because we were competitive. We wanted to outperform our peers, whether it was running or ruck. Like, we wanted to be the best because each guy to our left and right, they were the best versions of themselves. And that's what it was expected of us. That was the culture. And that's the culture in Sparta. We loved working out. Like, loved it. I still love it. It's so ingrained in my head. I'll have like strep throat and I'll still go work out. Now, one of the critiques is that throwing a javelin or throwing a discus, none of these events has any correlation with warfare. I'm sorry. It's so stupid. It boggles the mind. When you're doing some form of, if you're jump roping, right? Or you're lifting weights, what does squatting have to do with modern warfare? Really nothing, right? Like, unless your buddy goes down, you have to literally get him on your back and squat him up. It strengthens the leg muscles, but like most of my combat experience, we were on foot walking with a bunch of equipment on. The dude who weighed 220 pounds did as well, or less, actually didn't do as well as the guy who weighed like 180 pounds. But the dude that was 220 could squat a hell of a lot more than the little guy. So what's the point? The point is, as you do different athletic events, as you do different things, you are becoming more, or rather, you are more familiar with your body and your body's capabilities and manipulating your body. So like, for example, when I'm working out, I'm doing mostly weightlifting and like occasionally doing some running, maybe some rucking, like I mentioned earlier. What I wasn't doing was climbing walls with 120 pounds of kit on. But guess what? By doing different exercises and doing different calisthenics and all of the sort of athletic stuff that I was doing, all the exercising, it prepared me to get over that fucking wall. Like, I knew how to manipulate my body to get over it. Like I was in tune with everything and different muscle groups. Like, that's the point of training. That's the point of athletics. These guys are going, it's hoplite warfare. They were literally carrying and wearing heavy ass armor and thrusting spears and holding onto a shield static in front of them for God only knows how long. Maybe it's 2 hours, maybe it's 8 hours. And they were literally like the physicality required for these soldiers versus us today is dramatically different. Anyways, so them living in the gymnasium, them doing these workouts had a direct correlation with warfare. And so, yes, of course, by the way, they were doing events in Greece where they would do these races where they would put on their full kit, right? Helmet, armor, shield, spear, all greaves, everything. And they would race each other. Like, my dude, that is direct training for warfare, for hoplite warfare. Jeez, I'm sorry. Shit gets me fired up. The revisionist, the last thing I would just say simply is this attempt to disassociate athletic training from, preparedness for warfare. I would recommend to these revisionists, go talk to a 21-year-old NCO. Going and doing PT in the morning will not prepare their guys for war. Go tell a 3-star general who's in his 50s that, you know what, you take your company for a run. That has nothing to do with warfare. You're wasting your time. These guys are going to laugh in your fucking face. All right, so there are historians that agree with me. One of them is Paul Cartledge. He says, quote, Spartan education at the second stage, meaning when they're older, thus resembled nothing so much as a paramilitary assault course. Music and dancing were not dropped from the curriculum because they had religious associations and military applications. Encouraging fitness and a sense of rhythm was vital for the success of hoplite warfare. But it took the Spartans to transform the joyous social activity of dancing into a parade ground endurance test, as they did in the annual festival of the Gymnopaidae, celebrated at the height of Sparta's extraordinary hot summers. Paramilitary physical exercises were the order of the day for the Spartan male pre-citizen youth. I don't know how good of a job I've done laying this stuff out, but the Spartans were obsessed with, at least within the Agoge, athletic training, discipline, obedience to the law. All of these things are the cornerstone. They are the bedrock of creating and breeding a professional army. And you have to remember, at this time in human history, the idea of a professional army was completely a new concept. And I want to save this conversation actually for a later episode, but I just want to sort of hint at it here. There's this critique from, you guessed it, the revisionists, that suggests that so much of ancient Greek warfare was amateur. Compared to what? The recent ancestors to the ancient Greeks in the classical period, so far as I'm aware, were the Bronze Age heroes of Homer's time, if you will, the Trojan War. And they, so far as we can tell, at least according to the sparse written record that we have, these dudes were wearing a ton of bronze armor and just running into the fray and chaos and just massive melee. Like, there was little to no tactics in what they were doing. And if you go back even further, or really not that much further, we're talking about pastoral people. Like, imagine like who came before the Greeks. Like, the Greeks to us, who were the peoples before the Greeks? You want to talk about amateurish? Talk about like a group of farmers who are grabbing their pitchforks and their hoes and going to warfare with their neighbors. Like, that's amateur. But dudes wearing bronze armor, crosses, helmets, using different form of tactics. There was this, anyways, I get fired up about this. I'm going to talk about it in a later episode. So let's just wrap this one up. The Spartans were the best, without a doubt. And it had largely to do with their very strategic curriculum within the Agoge. But just you wait. We have a whole other episode about the most controversial aspect of the Agoge. I know what you're thinking. You thought, come on, Zach, like, you just got fired up more than I've ever seen you. I did. You're right. Stand by, because this next episode is going to be fucking fire. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society podcast. We'll see you next time.